problem with COVID is that you're doing a risk calculation. And the calculus of risk, of course, concerns the disease, but it's got also to concern the economy, the social, and the health impacts of the shutdown. So the science will only take you so far, and it's like, arguments over 2 meters, 1 meter distancing. I mean, in the end, these are political judgments that you've got to make. So I don't regard this as, you either follow the science or the politics. The scientists can tell you what they know, but sometimes what they know, by the way, is not that clear. But in the end, you're going to have to make a political judgment about these things. And you're all the time, every single government around the world is doing a risk calculus. And the most important thing, I think, is to engage people, since this is something that everyone's concerned with, right? Every single person wants to know about this. The best thing is to explain that risk calculus and take people into your confidence in explaining why these are difficult judgments in the end, and the science only takes you so far. The paradox of politics is that you begin at your least capable and most popular, and you end at your least popular and most capable. So by the time you've had a long experience of government, it's like anything else, but people never treat politics like this. The longer you go on, the more experience you get. And what you realize when it comes to something like this is you really have to reorganize government when you're facing something as overwhelming as this. And you have to broaden the skill base of the people taking the decisions. So this is why, in this situation, by the end of my time, maybe not at the beginning of my time, but by the end of it, I would have been pulling in people from every walk of life that could help bring different skills, knowledge, experience, creativity to dealing with this. And I just think it's a very difficult thing for governments to do, because what the government system, I always say this about our civil service, it actually works really well at a time of crisis, when the crisis is just an event that you have to react to. What it's less good at is when the crisis calls over a long period of time for skills that it's not surprising the civil service just don't have. But there are people who have those skills, and you've got to pull them into government and get them sat alongside the politicians. So I think that's really what I would say about this. And that's the reason why it's so difficult. It's a really difficult thing to deal with. But I think we can, going forward, we can make sure our economic damage is a lot less if there's the right relationship between the business sector and government, where I think there needs to be a really integrated approach where the politicians really understand what the problems of ordinary businesses, small as well as large, are going to face as a result of this, and how you help overcome them. All of those people in government will be working really hard on this. They'll be deeply committed to trying to get this right. I think, though, whereas I think in the first couple of months of the disease, virtually everything is excusable because you're doing it in hindsight. You're saying, well, you should have locked down earlier and so on. And obviously there'll be, people investigate and interrogate that. I think what is not excusable now is not, with the knowledge we now have, to realize that you've got to put in place everything that it can ensure that if there is a resurgence in the autumn and winter, then you're then fully prepared. Because that is if we manage to come through this crisis, through the summer, and it dies away, most governments around the world that I'm talking to at the moment are becoming, I would say, mildly, not strongly, mildly more optimistic. Okay, it may not look like that, but actually internal to the people I'm talking to in the US, in Europe, in the developing world even, they're getting more optimistic. If I was in government right now, though, I would be saying, look, is it that we're more optimistic because the lockdown's been so savage, we're bound to have a real impact on the disease? Is it that the summer months mean that the disease is less virulent? And I would conclude that I couldn't be sure. And therefore, it may be that we don't get a resurgence in autumn and winter, in which case the economies will come back in a much stronger way. But if for any reason it turns out that you do get a resurgence, then that's when you're going to have a serious, serious problem. Because I think to go back into lockdown is going to be really tough. And you just think of the lockdown and how it's been and living through this. And you know, let's be sort of frank and think about it, not as politicians or journalists, just as people. It's been a lot easier because the days are longer, the weather's been better. You know, it's not such a hardship to lock down when you know, in the summer months. You think of locking down in November and December, it's going to be really awful. So that's why I think that whatever criticism you can make of the past in relation to the government's handling of this, I'm not so interested in that, because for one thing, there's nothing we can do about it. What I really do think is important is to put in place the containment infrastructure that means if you do, for any reason, get a resurgence in the winter, then you've got such a big operation in place to handle it that you're able to handle it without going back into the sort of severe lockdown we've had in these last weeks.